and we have to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard.
Welcome to Gay USA. I'm Andy Hum.
I'm Ann Northrup.
And this is our special Thanksgiving Day show, whenever you are seeing it, because we're thankful to have Blanche Wiesen Cook as our guest for the entire hour tonight, and we're just thrilled. Now, for those of you who don't know, Blanche is a distinguished professor of history at John Jay College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's also been herself a progressive activist since the 1950s, and she's a noted biographer of Dwight Eisenhower. But she is also the author of this book, and that's why we're here to talk today. There's a picture of the book. Eleanor Roosevelt, The War Years, 1939 to 1962. It's the third volume on Eleanor Roosevelt that she's written. The first two volumes were New York Times bestsellers, and we expect this one to be too, if it's not already.
Not yet.
Okay. Well, give it time.
Yes, exactly.
You know, in the midst of the madness America's now experiencing, being able to spend more time with this book, I have to say, has been a refuge. Being able to go back to this and read about this great champion of human rights who coped with a world war and a deeply racist society, and securing human rights throughout the world in the aftermath in the war. And there really is, and I mean this, a revelation on every single page of this book. So here we are. Let's get started.
It's also eerie reading this book because of the echoes back and forth between her time and ours. But can we, and Blanche, we adore you, and we're really happy to have you here.
Well, Andy, and I love you. As you know, this is such a thrill. And Gay USA forever.
Thank you.
Yeah,
but,
I mean,
you know, you have been such an important peace activist, feminist activist, lesbian activist, anti-racism activist across the board. And it's all in this book, too. And I'd like to start, just because our audience has a wide range of ages, and it has been a while since Eleanor at this point. I'd ask you to situate her in history as, Andy yells at me when I refer to her as a first lady because she so transcends that. But her transcending of that is unique, I think. And when I look at the rest of the women who have occupied that position, I think, my God, this is just a different universe.
And put that picture up of her and Franklin, because she was married to Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States.
Right, she was. Indeed, she was. Yeah. And she is the niece of Theodore Roosevelt.
Yes.
And there's a new book called The Hissing Cousins, which deals with the rivalry between Eleanor, TR's favorite child, and his daughter, who really can't stand Eleanor Roosevelt. And it's a very interesting story.
She was married to the Republican Speaker of the House, wasn't she?
Yes.
Alice
Roosevelt Longworth.
Yes.
And they got divorced. Anyway, it's a very interesting rivalry because Eleanor Roosevelt really does become this great progressive. Yeah. And it's an amazing story. And it really starts in volume 1, where I talk about her childhood of loss and misery.
Both her parents died when she was very young.
Very young.
Her father was a bad alcoholic, which
right.
made her very distrustful of drinking or potential.
But it's also her commitment to people in want, in need, in trouble.
Yes.
She goes around the country and around the world. Tell me, what can I do for you? What
and that
do you
was early
want?
on.
Early on, from the very beginning. What do you want? What do you need? She wants to make things better for everybody in want and need. People just like her own family. I mean, how much do you have to drink to die at the age of 34?
Which her father did.
Which her father did.
A lot.
So her mother turns her face to the wall. Eleanor is 8. Her father dies. She loves him. She's 10. Yeah. And she is this orphan. Protected a bit by her grandmother and aunts, but not very much. And then she goes off to school in England, where she is encouraged by the headmistress, Marie Sylvestre, who sees her, who appreciates her brilliance and her power, and who encourages her to think for herself, to be bold, and to do sports and music. And Eleanor Roosevelt, at the age of 76, says the happiest day of her life is the day she made the first team at field hockey.
Yes!
Yes!
I've always pushed that.
Right.
But I really want to have you explain the difference between Eleanor in her position as First Lady, or before or after, and what I see is the ineffectual
role of First Lady.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, she's the first one who takes to her pen to criticize her husband, and she has her own daily column, My Day, from 1936 until her death. She's also known as the First Lady of Radio. She writes dozens of articles a month, and she writes about 20 books. I mean,
and these were not books about how to bake cookies.
No, she really is a political activist. And her mantra, her theme, is that governments exist for only one purpose: to make life better for all people. And in the beginning, when FDR has polio and his mother encourages him to just become, a member of the gentry, a gentleman farmer, you don't have to work anymore, and Eleanor says, no, you'll be very bored, you love politics, and really encourages him to re-enter politics. And she and this magnificent man, Louis Howe, who disappears after Volume 1, but whose impact on her is very real. And so he says to Eleanor Roosevelt, you be his eyes and his ears. He can't travel, he can't meet people. And FDR trusts that. That's part of their deal. That's part of their arrangement. He says to his friends, anybody will tell anything to my wife. And he really trusts that she is not only his eyes and his ears, but, as all of his friends say, his conscience. And that's their arrangement. And he doesn't silence her, even when he doesn't want to support the things that she fights for. He says, build a democratic movement, make me do it. I mean, because he too is a Democrat. And she believes to the very end, even though they disagree about the most profound things during the war, race and rescue, that basically he is with her, but he has to juggle this hideous Congress of what we now call Dixiecrats. And we see how hideous this Congress can be in our own lifetime, having just witnessed it with President Obama.
People forget that the Democrats were the racist party forever, the Southern Democrats especially, but Northern Democrats as well. The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln, got rid of slavery, fought the Democrats.
And the party of Eisenhower.
Yes.
Eisenhower was a liberal Republican, and people forget how truly segregated the U.S. was. In World War II, it's about integrating the military. The military doesn't get integrated until Eisenhower's presidency. Truman says it should be integrated, but it doesn't happen until Eisenhower goes around to every base and fires every bird colonel who doesn't want to integrate his base. The other thing, blood plasma is segregated. People don't know this. Blood plasma is segregated, black and white, Christian and Hebrew, until 1958. And Eisenhower, by executive order, says, we're going to integrate blood plasma. The head of the Red Cross, a guy named General Al Grunther, who's his buddy from the military, calls him and says, Ike, you can't do that. The South doesn't want integrated blood. 1958, Ike says, then they won't get any blood.
But let's go back to the war. Eleanor Roosevelt helps with not the integration of the military, because they didn't allow that during the war.
Right.
But black soldiers and sailors were only basically allowed to be cooks and people to clean up. And she advocates for the Tuskegee Airmen.
Right. Pilots.
Pilots, to let them fly, and they do organize them, and yet they're not flying. So we have a picture of this. She goes up on the plane with them.
Absolutely.
And
and
How was that
changes the
received?
story. Well, in the white press, it's received with horror. In the black press, it's received with jubilation, but it begins to change military opinion and public opinion. It begins to change. And the Tuskegee Airmen are one of the most, prominently heroic folks during World War II. They are bemedaled, and they are, there's a whole list in my book of what great things they really did.
She was an amazing activist on racial issues long before what we think of as the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s.
Right.
It was somewhat of a revelation to me to read how deeply she was involved, how committed she was, and how outspoken she was.
Right. And it starts in 1934, as early as that, when the educators of America meet and pass a resolution unanimously saying segregation should be abolished. It does terrible things to everybody. It encourages black children to think they are inferior, white children to assume they are superior, and it destroys all hope for community. Whereupon, and this is May 1934, and everybody should read the whole speech in volume 2, Eleanor Roosevelt strides upon the stage and says, how stupid we have been to limit the education of any of our children. We must educate all our children and recognize that we will all go ahead together or we will all go down together.
I love it when you imitate Ellen.
This is
You're missing your performing career.
I missed it, yes. I really am a thespian.
And she was a life member of the NAACP. And look, we're going to cover a lot of topics, but as long as we're on race, she's also the one who quit the Daughters of the American Revolution.
Right.
Talk about that, and Marian Anderson.
Right. I mean, here is this great global diva who is the hero of the opera, and
Marian Anderson.
There she is.
On the right there,
and
with Eleanor.
She is to sing at Constitution Hall, owned by, or not even owned by, but presided over by the Daughters of the American Revolution, who say, no, she can't sing. Horrifying everybody in Washington, not everybody, but the progressives and the Democrats, the small d Democrats. And Harold Ickes and Eleanor Roosevelt say, well, she should sing at the Lincoln Memorial. And so on Easter Sunday, and Eleanor Roosevelt quits the DAR, and a lot of people don't speak to her after she does that. People who had been friends with her, they're horrified that she has quit the DAR over this racial event. And Marian Anderson sings at the Lincoln Memorial, and over 75,000 people are there enraptured, and it's broadcast all over the country and all over the world, and it is really one of those.
It was a fundamental turning point,
it really
I think,
is a turning point.
in public opinion.
Absolutely.
But at the same time,
she got a lot of praise in the press for it.
But she was also accused of being a communist for her support of African American people and an integrated society. And I mean, we'll go through back and forth with this, but I am struck by, we are today, as we sit here recording, talking about the nomination coming of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General of the United States in 2016, a man who has said that civil rights organizations like the NAACP are communist.
Right.
That any work on racial issues is by communists.
He's never been to an NAACP convention. It's like going to church.
Right. It is like going to church. Moreover, every civil rights leader in the U.S. in the 40s and 50s was branded a communist. And so John Edgar Hoover, or J. Edgar Comey, whatever, I mean, here they are, hounding the civil rights movement. So you have people like Virginia Durr, Ann Braden, these great white heroes for civil rights in Alabama and Georgia. And they're all attacked. Not just by the Klan, they are attacked by the Klan, and crosses are burned on their property, but they are followed, their phones are tapped, they are called communists, and Eleanor Roosevelt is called a communist by J. Edgar Hoover. Her phones are tapped, her beds are bugged in hotel rooms, and it really is, and 80% or maybe 90% of her huge FBI file that goes on for over 4,000 pages is anything she says against lynching, anything she says against segregation or racial violence. And J. Edgar Hoover, in his sidebars along the reports, calls her that old cow, meeting with her commie friends again, that old hen. I mean, it's disgusting.
People have to remember that it was impossible in this period to pass an anti-lynching bill,
Right.
and she could not even get Franklin to come out for it
Right.
because he depended on the Southern Democrats.
For the
what
New
did an
Deal.
anti-lynching bill say that was so controversial?
It just said lynching is murder.
Well,
Because there were laws, and there's still, isn't there still
State
something
laws.
about you can, for some crimes, you can still kill people in ways that are otherwise, I don't know.
Some of those crazy laws.
But the echoes of that with certainly the attacks on Hillary Clinton. Now, we're not Hillary's greatest fans, and we think she's not been as bold as Eleanor.
I voted for her.
Yeah, well, I did too.
We all
but
voted
we
for
all
her.
voted for her, but we would have liked her to be more Eleanorian.
Yes.
Yes.
And she said
Well,
she used to speak to Eleanor when
yes,
she was in the
I
White
think,
House.
I
Spiritually.
think she misjudged. If Eleanor really, spoke to her more clearly at this election, she said, "Remember, I said we must have jobs for everybody."
Yes.
So I think that would be a very big issue. Jobs for everybody. The other thing is Eleanor Roosevelt, before Bernie Sanders, in 1943, Eleanor Roosevelt called for free public education, excellent public education, K through college. College has to be free and available for all American young people.
And it was in the city of New York.
And it was. The city,
Up until
that's
the
right,
70s.
up until the 70s. And with
Where
open
you teach.
enrollment, where I teach, with open enrollment and the SEEK program, the tuition started to rise. And so you have great leaders like Julius C.C. Edelstein, who gave us open enrollment and the SEEK program and fought to preserve free tuition. He lost. And,
Well, I went to the University of Virginia. It was only $700 a semester, and I was out of state. And that now is an enormously expensive school
Right.
for out of state and for in-state students.
Yeah.
But we've
And they're
abandoned
closing,
that.
yeah, they're closing public colleges all over the country, including the great School of Journalism at UCLA, which closed last year.
And abandoning public
Yeah.
education for...
And ending sports and music programs. I mean,
yes.
who would want to go to school without sports and music? I was first violinist in Mr. Stone's children's orchestra. I got my violin to take home. I didn't have to buy it.
And a gymnast.
And a gymnast, yes, I was. My life is an accident.
Yeah. Well, do you want to delve into why we're such a stupid country and why we have this great divide? And
I think we've lost the I think that we really have to look at stolen elections, at redistricting, at gerrymandering, at the end of the Voter Rights Act,
Sure.
at the fact that in communities like Madison, Wisconsin, 300,000 people, young people, students, and old people, Democrats, were turned away from polls. So we're looking at a stolen election, and we're looking at,
What can we do about that?
well, I think
nonetheless,
we need to rebuild.
tens of millions of people have voted for this fascist government that is now taking power. And I find that
more
confounding.
people voted, at least 2 to 6 million
Yes.
more voted
Absolutely.
for Hillary and the others. It's very scary. It's very scary. And I think that we really, part of it is the media, the mainstream network media, which has lost its which has really lost everything. Whatever happened to equal time for equal
Oh, that's
candidates?
no longer a law. But 30 years, up till 30 years ago, the networks
had to do equal time.
Well, they were loss leaders, the news divisions. The networks were proud of doing comprehensive news. There were
Public service,
the networks
documentaries.
did documentaries in
Right.
prime time, and then in the 80s,
The Reagan Revolution.
the networks were bought by bigger corporations. They used to be independent, and the corporations came in and said, why, there's a profit center we've been missing. It's the news division. And that is literally how it changed. Ken
And cable-
Auletta wrote a book about it. It's
And cable television isn't bound by any strictures
No
of
rules
fairness
at
at
all.
all.
Yeah.
And so you have Fox News, but even on CNN and all these other places,
The
they're not
conservative-
doing a good job of informing people and balancing things.
Well, I think
Look at that
that's really
stupid Leslie Stahl interview with the Trumps. She didn't ask us any good questions or penetrate him at all.
really scary.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, what's happened, the dumbing down of America, it's not an accident that we've closed public schools all over the country. It's not an accident that fewer and fewer people are going to colleges. It's not an accident. I think we're really looking at the origins of a fascist putsch, and we've lived through it, not quite seeing it, and now we see it. And so now we have to regroup and take it all back and fight for it again.
Block
Revolution.
by block,
And as
precinct by precinct.
Eleanor Roosevelt said, it's about the movement. You cannot trust politicians to do. You have to build a movement, door to door,
Right.
block by block, community by community, to make our wants and our needs known and heard. She called it trooping for democracy. And that's what we have to do.
People who are waiting for Chuck Schumer to take a lead and start calling the government out for what it is now are not going to be happy.
No, but there is Elizabeth Warren, and there is Bernie Sanders, and there is a movement. There is a whole new movement, and maybe when Clinton recovers from her depression, which is inevitable, she will recover, she can join the movement, and her voice
But it needs
might
to be
good.
younger.
It needs to be younger.
I mean, even Elizabeth Warren is in her mid to late 60s.
But she's good. I mean,
Yeah,
you know,
but we
but she
really
has young
need-
people around her.
Yes, that's what
And
we
there are
need.
young people all around.
And
I
Eleanor
think
was very involved
She
with
was
youth.
the youth movement.
Yeah.
You really encourage the youth movement. And that's our job as educators and media folks. I mean, you are encouraging the young people. I'm encouraged, you know, and they encourage me. They teach me more than I teach them.
Talk about
They're
your
great.
students. You teach at John Jay, you teach at the Graduate Center at
I
CUNY
do.
too.
Yes.
Talk about your students and who they are and what they say, particularly in the wake of this election.
Well, my students, a lot of them didn't want to vote at all after Bernie. They were all for Bernie, and then they didn't want to vote. They said it didn't matter. And I encouraged them that it did matter. But given that they were in my class and they went to vote, what about all the other students? And that's really the crisis that we're in. A lot of folks were just completely, I mean, less than half of the electorate voted.
yes.
This is very scary. And so we need to reconsider what a democratic movement is. And it has to be changed. And that's what Elizabeth Warren and Bernie and the movement is in the process of doing.
So
we need new leadership, we need new vision.
See
And
anybody
I
on the
think-
horizon besides people you've mentioned?
Well, I think we don't know who's going to be on the horizon because it's going to be another generation we haven't met yet. But I think they're out there, like Black Lives Matter. They are out there.
Yeah.
And I think there's a whole very vigorous, you know, outright, you know, which used to be Eagle Herc, but is now
Yes.
outright. The
Yes.
global gay rights movement is very powerful. There's a movement called nesri.org to get the Economic and Social Rights Initiative, the Covenant, taken seriously, a group of young people who are really great activists.
Well-
so I feel very encouraged.
Maybe because you are teaching and do have daily contact, I'm of course impressed.
Also, a lot of my students at John Jay are veterans. And the Veterans for Peace are, I think, some of the most powerful voices we have. I'm very moved by them. They know what they're talking about. They've been there. They are really organizing.
Well, John
And-
Jay, in fact, is the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and we think of it historically as, you know, the college that people went to become police officers or whatever, and thought of it
But it was
stereotypically.
created to stop. It was created in the 60s because there was so much of community violence. And so we existed to what kind of community policing can there be so the violence would evaporate and we would have peace officers, not cops bashing your
So
head.
tell us more about what they think and
Well, we
what their
teach for
values are.
justice, and our students are really, a lot of them are fabulous. Some of my students were there last night. You know, they're people they've gone to law school, they've done great work, they're doing great work. They, you know, the ACLU, the CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, these are organizations that encourage justice, U.S. justice, global justice. And I feel very hopeful about.
Great.
Can we go back to some of Eleanor's origins of how she got involved in all this? I mean, her marriage with Franklin was troubled. I mean, they were great partners to the end.
Right.
And respected each other and loved each other. But in terms of what we traditionally think of as a marriage, and she surrounded herself with a lot of strong women.
Right.
Let's talk about some of those relationships. Talk about Lorena Hickok, who we've heard of. You were one of the only biographers who really deals with the fact that they had a romantic love with each other.
Absolutely.
Even Ken Burns doesn't want to bring
No,
this out.
he
He'll bring
doesn't.
out that Lorena's a lesbian, but not Eleanor.
Right. Well, the
Or
origins.
bisexual.
The origins of my book were a review I did on this really stupid book by Doris Faber, who was horrified by these love letters. She couldn't believe that these letters couldn't possibly mean what they seemed to mean.
Between Lorena and Eleanor.
I can't wait to lie down beside you and take you in my arms. And so, you know, ultimately I wrote a very nasty review. These letters do mean, you know, a cigar may not always be a cigar, Pache Sigmund Freud, but the northeast corner of your mouth against my lips is always the northeast corner. And that was basically, but I didn't start doing this because I'm, you know, a military historian. I was doing international relations. I just finished my Eisenhower book. And I read this book because Kate Stimson had sent it to me, lonely and miserable in Abilene, where you couldn't eat, a dry town, you couldn't even get wine with dinner. So I made friends with the local sheriff, and we shot guns and drank his single malt.
Eisenhower's hometown.
Eisenhower's hometown. And when I got back after doing this review, I called Joe Lash, who was my pal. He had blurred my book on Crystal Eastman, saying this is a book that should stay in print forever.
Explain who he is.
Okay, Joe Lash was Eleanor Roosevelt's sort of chosen son, her bestie in the last years of her, you know, the later years of her life, and her biographer, and a really wonderful writer and journalist. And so I called him up and I said, what's up with you not having Hick in any of your books at all? Doesn't mention her. And he said, I hated her. Let's have dinner. So we had dinner, and he explained to me that he hated her because she was an anti-Semite and a bigot. And so Joe and his wife, Trude, who is this great German scholar, she graduated from the University of Freiburg in 1931, comes to the U.S., teaches at Hunter, graduated with a PhD, I should say, teaches at Hunter and goes back to Germany to run an anti-Nazi paper. Peter Pratt, who's fallen in love with her, Peter Pratt, Pratt Institute, Pratt Oil, follows her back to Berlin. They get married. Hitler, the Nazis destroy the newspaper office, kill her editors, destroy her home, come to power in January. They leave for the U.S. in February '33, and she has 3 children. Meets Joe Lash about 1940, and they fall in love. It's a very interesting relationship. And Eleanor Roosevelt, a little part of the book is Eleanor Roosevelt encouraging Trude to get divorced. Real love matters. And that raises the question, always. Maybe she was sorry she never got divorced, or maybe she just wanted, it's unclear. Bottom line, Joe takes me up to Hyde Park, and I see that there really is a story to tell, because he's the good son. Anything Eleanor Roosevelt wanted him to deal with, he dealt with. She didn't want to deal with, he didn't. She said, "I don't care about power." He wrote that. Then I knew I had a story. And hence I decided, okay, I could do it. He encouraged me to do a biography.
And you were willing to write about Hick, and others were not.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's not just...
And I thought it was important to write about Hick, who's very important.
A journalist,
to Eleanor
by the
Roosevelt. Yes. Who says to Eleanor Roosevelt, "Why are you sending me all these letters, these 10-page letters detailing your day? The whole country wants to know how you spend your day." And that's the origins of her column.
Her column, My Day, which was published 6 days a week.
Right.
She was so energetic.
Right.
And then there are the other women who were also lesbian, who were great influences on her.
Esther Lape is my favorite.
And Elizabeth Reed,
and
a couple.
Elizabeth Reed, a couple. Elizabeth Reed became her financial advisor, and Esther Lape was a great scholar. And
advocate for universal health care.
Universal health care, what we now call single payer,
yes.
Which was supposed to be in the 1935 Social Security Act. But the AMA lobbied it to death.
And now a lot of doctors are in favor of it.
Yeah, right. Well, we need single payer.
Yeah.
That's
Every
we're
doctor
the only,
I go to wants single
We're
payer.
the only country in the industrial world without it. It's crazy. So Eisenhower in 1957, who has fired Eleanor Roosevelt in 53. He doesn't want, to be part of the UN human rights effort. But in 57, with the Health Reinsurance Act, he encourages Eleanor Roosevelt and Esther Lape to come back and help him get what he wants, which is like single payer, simple, just like in the military, everybody covered. Mm-hmm. And Ovida Kolpabi, who is also a life member of the NAACP, and people don't know that. She'd been head of the WACs. She agrees, but the AMA lobbies it, and it becomes just the Health Reinsurance Act, Medicaid, Medicare. And Esther Lape is given the pen by Eisenhower that he signed in front of a press conference, and she waves it, and she says, "Now this represents just a puny little bone in the vertebrae."
Good,
what
I love that.
Had in mind.
But she's hanging out with a lesbian couple.
Yes.
She's very close to.
And then she lives with a lesbian couple, Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman. They have a falling out in Volume 2.
Yeah. But was any of this known publicly at the time?
No.
Were any of these
No.
people living it all openly? Was there any
They're
pushback?
all living openly. Nobody notices it.
Okay.
Nobody
Yes,
talks about it.
We're
They're
all
all
invisible.
invisible.
But she.
They used the phrase "new women" for some of these women. Yes.
Well,
was that a phrase in those days?
The 20s, new women, but they're called she-men. Some of Eleanor Roosevelt's friends who go around in, riding jodhpurs and so on. FDR's pals call them she-men. And even FDR calls them she-men.
Well,
on occasion.
and I was going to ask what his attitude was
Well,
to.
his attitude is welcoming because he is having
His own stuff.
serial women in his life, including this first Lucy Merson. That almost breaks them up because Eleanor Roosevelt feels really betrayed. But by the time Missy LeHand becomes the junior wife, Eleanor Roosevelt is merely grateful that he has someone to be with him all the time, because she does not want to be with him all the time.
No, but she seemed to have complicated relationships with other men too. Would you describe her as bisexual or?
Well, I describe her as a serial romantic. I don't know what her physical connection to any of these people are. In the case of Earl Miller, if you look at Earl Miller, I've created this, this category, why not? I mean, he's so...
And who was he to her?
He is first her bodyguard.
Right.
And FDR assigns him to protect her. But he becomes immediately one of her best friends, and they shoot together. She doesn't want to be tailed by security, And he says, okay, then learn how to shoot. So he gets her a gun, and they shoot together. But they like to shoot, so they do targets. And then he buys her horse, Dot, and they ride together, and they camp together, and they swim together, and they do all kinds of things together. And he also plays the piano like her father did, and he sings. And he has a lot of showbiz friends, like Mayrus Cheney, who is called Tiny. And so there's a whole other world that Eleanor inhabits with Earl Miller. And that the mystery of Earl Miller is that all their correspondence has disappeared. There is no correspondence between them that has survived.
If anybody out there knows where it
drives
is,
hanging
we'd like
around.
to see it. But I mean, so she has all these different social circles. Not everybody gets along with each other all the time.
There's tension. And she ignores it.
But she also, because of all the pressure on her and things, she also has a lot of sadness and depression to some extent in her life.
Right.
I mean, you talk about her
Griselda moods
during the presidency, going off to Rock Creek Park Cemetery. We have a picture of this, to this statue of grief that Henry Adams put up for his wife who committed suicide.
After
and
he had an affair.
And she sits there for hours,
right,
before this statue.
And she brings all of her friends, all of her new friends, sit with her and contemplate grief, so they could so she feels they will understand the origins of her moods. And how she gets out of these Griselda moods is to do more and more work. The more work she does, the better she feels.
And we're all in a Griselda mood right now,
right,
and need to get out of it.
Absolutely.
If we're going to turn things around.
So we have to march again, my darlings, is what I've been saying everywhere.
Will Melania be leading us to a new era?
I doubt it.
I don't know. I think she's
doubt
probably unhappy to be trapped in the White House. I think her
Well, they may
attitude-
not even move to the White House.
That's
it
true,
looks
they
like
may
they're just
not.
going to take over.
Stay in the Gold House.
Yeah. My God.
But it seems, even with the progressive attitudes of Hillary and Michelle Obama in the First Lady position, it seems to me unimaginable that someone could be as active and as political as Eleanor was these days. And I'm astonished that she could have done all that then, and that we have lost all that now.
Right.
What was her trick? How did she get away with it? Because she was always being scrutinized. How did she make it happen in the context of her role as First Lady?
I think she just ignored opposition. She just ignored the terrible things that were written about her, and she said, courage can be as contagious as fear. Yes. And when she was viciously attacked by various right-wing press people, she just ignored it. And FDR encouraged her to ignore it. You don't want to get into a pissing match with those people, he said, and she didn't. She just ignored it.
And he, unlike many of our current, even Obama, he would say about the opposition, I welcome their hatred.
Yes, he did.
And they're the other side, and I'm fighting them.
Right.
And Obama, like, I'm conciliator, and it didn't work.
It didn't work. Didn't work. I mean, FDR was right in 1940 when he said, we will have a liberal democracy or we will return to the dark ages. That was his campaign.
A watchword for today.
Yes, we certainly seem to be on the brink of that. But he, she had deep divisions with him on things like the internment of Japanese citizens,
right.
Which we may now be facing again. The Republicans are now quoting that as precedent.
She was totally mystified by his executive order. She just could not believe it. And she went to visit the camps. And she humanized.
Let's pause there. She went to visit the Japanese internment camps as a movement against the fact that people were interned like that.
Right. And she encouraged young people to go to college, and all kinds of colleges said, yes, you come.
To the young people from those camps.
Yes. And they did.
And to the service.
And
the
joined
armed
the
services.
service. And then, you know, what is it? The 444 is one of the most bemedaled of all the divisions. They did
Japanese soldiers who fought against the Germans.
Yes.
And the Japanese American Civil Something League was the first organization of that kind to come out in favor of marriage equality in the 90s, which was quite astonishing. And she also had a deep division with her husband over the rejection of ships carrying Jewish refugees from Germany.
Yeah. I think the hardest thing to understand is his refusal to fire Breckinridge Long.
Who was that?
Okay, Breckinridge Long was this beast in the State Department who is FDR. They went to, you know, Groton and Harvard together. They're pals. And FDR keeps promoting him. So ultimately, he is in charge of all the State Department personnel, and he is in charge of all refugee issues. And what happens, the first big astonishing event is the SS St. Louis, which has come, you know, with 900 refugees from Hitler's Europe, and everybody knows what is going on. This is 1939. The King and Queen of England are in the White House and at Hyde Park this weekend, and they share headlines with the passage of the SS St. Louis, which is not allowed to land or disembark and goes back to Europe.
And most of those people are exterminated.
Well, most of those people ultimately are exterminated. Many wound up in London, and some didn't go back. You know, they are divided in the details. Not all of them.
And she worked very hard for a bill to just let, I think it was it 20,000 young Jewish children
Children's
in.
bill.
And then people would make comments like, yeah, but they're going to grow up to be old, ugly Jews. And things like this. This is the kind of stuff Americans said.
Nits make lice, say one of her family friends. Nits make
So the bill
lice.
didn't pass.
No. But the
and
bottom
she fought for it.
She fought for it, and FDR doesn't speak for it. Let me go back to the ship, because the SS St. Louis goes back, the ship of tears. The next ship is the Kwanzaa, and there are 80 people stranded in Virginia Bay, and she says they can come, they can stay here as my guests. And she gets some of her State Department allies to go and say, okay, we're letting them in. Whereupon Breckinridge Long goes crazy, and he goes to FDR, and you cannot allow this to happen. I have all the power here. And FDR agrees. All of the future details about refugees will be ordered and dealt with by Breckinridge Long. That he doesn't fire him is truly amazing, and I don't understand it. And this continues until 1944, when Henry Morgenthau says, okay, we have to have an emergency refugee committee, a bureau that bypasses the State Department. We've got to get people in. And FDR by then agrees to that, 1944. And Ruth Gruber, who just died yesterday at the age of 105, and I did 3 interviews with her on CUNY TV, which folks might like to look at.
Talk about what she did.
And she becomes the hero of Haven, this one camp for only 1,000 people. And they are allowed to come in. They have this haven. They do live. It's kind of a camp, but it's a very pleasant camp up in upstate New York. And then there's some fear that at the end of the war they're going to go back. They're going to be sent back. And Eleanor Roosevelt says, no, they can't be sent back.
One of them was Ray Harding, who became head of the Liberal Party in New York.
Right.
Not so liberal.
But no, not so liberal at the end. But what about but where's the Emergency Relief Committee today? I mean, the United States has destroyed the Middle East, and there are all these refugees, and they can't come here to the country that caused all the problems.
The Emergency Rescue Committee still exists. It still operates. It is agitating for refuge and havens.
But where's the heart in this country that we don't recognize that we created these problems and we're not taking these people in?
Andy, it's terrible. It's terrible, but we've got to do it. we've got to really make clear there's 64 or 65 million refugees right now from around the Middle East and around the world. And the U.S. says, well, we'll only take in 1,000. I mean, and it's really creepy. It's really, really creepy, and it's immediate. And then you have this new president saying, well, we're going to get rid of all immigrants, or
we're going to register Muslim American citizens. We're going to maybe put people in camps. We're going to. How do you feel about comparisons to the 40s, to the Nazi regime, to World War II?
I think we can use the F word. This is called fascism. That's what it is. We don't want camps. We don't. I mean, it's really more Mussolini than Hitler at this point, but we don't know what it's going to become as he puts in people who are celebrated by the American Nazi Party. I mean, we didn't know we had a Nazi Party to that extent, but now we have people in office who are celebrated by what is, now we know, the American Nazi Party.
And the Ku Klux Klan.
And the Ku Klux Klan. So I think we're on a new level of insanity that we have never been.
Certainly,
in the U.S.
Certainly the verge of some very scary stuff.
Very scary.
Let's just take Eleanor, because you do, through the end of her life, because she had a spectacular life after her White House years, after her husband died, and she moved out, and she was appointed reluctantly, or she took the appointment reluctantly to the UN, and then
by Truman.
Yes,
Yeah.
and ended up doing the Universal Declaration for
which
Human
is
Rights.
still
Which we
the
have a
beacon.
picture of.
Her with it, yes.
It is still the beacon of hope for the U.S. and the whole world. And if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
as she is there.
As she is there, it stands for everything she has fought for all of her life. We will have peace when everybody has education, healthcare, housing, dignity, respect, equality, and purpose.
And why don't we have those things?
Well, we have to fight for it yet again, and still, and still. And Truman actually says to her, don't fight for the economic and social rights. Those are Soviet originated things. And Eleanor Roosevelt says, no, you can't talk human rights to people who are hungry. And she said, if you want me to do this, I'll resign. And he doesn't want her to resign. So it goes through, and her brilliant diplomacy enables it to pass so that the Soviet Union, furious about some aspects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, only abstains. So it passes. But she agrees to a compromise, and it's a devastating compromise, to divide the Universal Declaration into two parts: the economic and social rights and the civil and political rights. Whereupon the U.S. ratifies it with those two covenants, and then the covenants have to be dealt with separately and later, and not much later, because Eisenhower becomes president in '53, and John Foster Dulles wants no part of the UN or the Universal Declaration.
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State. And Eleanor Roosevelt is gone. But she goes across the street and joins the UNA, the United Nations Association, and lobbies. But the bottom line is the Universal Declaration doesn't come up again until Jimmy Carter. And it doesn't really get ratified, any part of it, until, and folks don't know this, George Herbert Walker Bush, when the Soviet Union collapses. When he says, okay, now it's time to stand for civil and political rights. And his son, George Warbush, if somebody does an Oedipal biography, everything Daddy does, I do different. So he cancels, yes, we can have torture, yes, we can have all these prisons, secret prisons. I mean, really, the whole thing is so
But let's
scary.
not underestimate the immense achievement that her getting this thing passed was.
Right,
It was
it was
touch
great.
and go all the way.
All the way.
And she did it. And you talk about her diplomacy, but what was it, that she was just beloved around the world? That she was the one who could do this?
She was. She is, you know, Stevenson calls her the first, or maybe it's Truman calls her the first lady of the world. She really is beloved. And the press wants to hear what she thinks. She gets more press time than anybody. She is the first lady of radio. And her opinions matter. And she goes and she travels the world, encouraging people. She says, tell me, what do you want? What do you need? And that's her life.
And she rejected all attempts to get her to run for office.
She would rather be chloroformed than run for office.
We feel the same way.
But when you say going to people and saying, what do you want, what do you need? We were at a meeting the other night, and this is what one of the women said to us. If the Democrats ever want to win back the Rust Belt or a lot of these other areas, you have to be with people.
Yes.
You have to live among them, and you have to work with them
absolutely.
for what they need, not just ask for their votes.
That's right. Absolutely.
And
well, look at Arthurdale, the community that she created in 1934. This great community in the poorest mining area in West Virginia. And it was Hick who said, you want to see the poorest place in America? People are living in caves and in culverts. And she went there and said, this is horrible. Let's build a community. Everybody gets 1 or half an acre or 1 or 2 acres. Everybody gets hot and cold running water and flush toilets at a time when 80% of rural America didn't have that. And Harold Ickes, the Secretary of Interior, daddy to this generation's Harold Ickes, writes to FDR, do you know what your wife is doing down there? She's spending money like a drunken sailor. If she has her way, how are we going to tell the rich from the poor? He says that. And Eleanor Roosevelt says, well, in matters of such simple dignity and decency, we should not have to tell the rich from the poor.
She was a communist.
A socialist.
Well.
A democratic socialist.
I'm kidding.
She also,
She was a socialist. I think Bernie uses that word. It's never been used before. But I think we have to start using the word socialism.
Well, I think we have a lot of education to do to make people understand what's really in their best interest, because they've been so lied to and so sold down the river with this nonsense for so many years, so much fear, so much anger, and so much misdirection that has led us to this point. I just
want to say one other thing about prisons, the prison industrial complex, which, a lot of people really do blame the crime bill of 1996 or 94 on Clinton. So we have mandatory minimums and, the privatization of prisons, which is so hideous, the building of these prison corps. Eleanor Roosevelt, before Angela Davis came later, Eleanor Roosevelt wanted to abolish prisons. We don't need prisons. We need education and rehabilitation. We need counseling and help for all our troubled people. And so she worked with the Wiltwick boys, and she visited women in prison. Every time she visited women in prison, she would write her friends, I could have been any one of the women on the inside, which always made me wonder if she too could have killed her husband. But the abolition of prison.
Yes. Well, we laugh like, oh, that's ridiculous, that'll never happen here, and maybe it won't happen here, but it is happening around the world. Norway has prisons like that, where even murderers are allowed to work in the kitchen with knives, and everybody gets respect. And the guards say, no, we treat them like human beings because they are human beings, and we're all in this together.
We're all in this together. And can I read how I dedicated the book?
Yes, please.
Because we are all in this together, and she understood that. This book is dedicated to all those activists and agitators who resist tyranny, challenge authority, fight for peace, freedom, and human rights as we continue our journey for one world, no borders, no boundaries, no walls.
Can you all get behind that, viewers?
It is Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Well, I ping pong back and forth between an optimistic view and a very cynical view, and I think the world contains both, and I haven't figured out how to tip it to the side I prefer of the optimism.
And you've been working pretty hard on it.
Well, whatever.
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt said, pessimism is politically incorrect.
Really?
We have to be optimistic because we have to continue to fight.
Well, I
And
think that's more fun than being pessimistic.
Yes, we have to fight. Life is about the struggle.
Yeah.
Life is about the struggle. And we just came back from Washington, where we went to the new African American History Museum, and there's this quote from Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois: "The history of the 20th century is the history of the color line." And under it, the history of the 21st century is the refusal to acknowledge the color line. Mm-hmm. And life is about the struggle.
And I think that was the big divide in the electorate.
Right, right.
If it wasn't about race, it wasn't about anything.
There's a little misogyny thrown in,
yes,
too.
I think, as Eleanor said, men hate women with power. So you have J. Edgar Comey doing what he did. You have the male hysterics. I think it was a lot misogyny. And
I agree
racism.
completely.
It was on display.
Yes.
We are very thankful
Yes.
to have been able to spend this time with you.
And I'm very thankful to spend this time with you.
And we're going to bring you back. This is a conversation to be continued. But people, this is Volume 3. Volumes 1 and 2 still available. Eleanor Roosevelt, The War Years and After, 1939 to 1962. And we want to go out with that concert of Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington that was created when Eleanor Roosevelt stood up for Marian Anderson in the face of
1939.
After rejection by the DAR.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Genius draws no color line. And so it is fitting that Marian Anderson should raise her voice in tribute to the noble Lincoln whom mankind will ever honor. Miss Marian Anderson.